Alrighty, today I want to talk about a little bit of supply and demand in the sort of dynamic of younger men and women, especially in my generation. So right now what's in high supply is women with confidence. Okay, and I'm not saying that's bad, but I just want to talk about it. So you have women with confidence, and then you have a high supply of men that are unconfident and typically shy. Now, what this creates is kind of this awkward situation because all throughout history, it's been men that have been the ones who have been confident and women who have been more reserved and shy. I think the dynamic of, an overabundance of shy men and then a overabundance of confident women really hurts the sort of dynamic. And typically women want to be led. They don't want to do the leading, which is 100% understandable. But the problem is that a lot of men don't know how to lead. Okay, well, now we have the problem, and that begs the question, well, how do we get it so men know how to lead? And yeah, we could go back and forth all day about, well, the father should have taught him this. Oh, well, the mother should have taught him that. But as of right now, we're kind of past that point where, oh, well, the parents should have taught him and raised him better. Because a lot of people, like including myself, have already kind of grown out of that and are adults in this society. So like going back and like harping on your parents for not teaching you X, Y, and Z, yeah, it might feel good in the moment and in the short term, but it still doesn't really like fix anything. So now with this overabundance of men who are too shy to really speak out, and I know a lot of females will say, well, on one hand, that's a good thing because of like all the men that were abusive towards women, this, that, and the other. It's easy to say that just for you to like feel good, but however, you also have to think about, well, it was too much. It was too much to one end of the spectrum, which is why I'm a huge advocate of not playing in like such extremes like in these kind of issues, because there really is like a middle ground to be had. It's not so black and white. It's not so this or that, because now we have a lot of women who are coming out, at least on social media, where they say like, dude, where's all the good men at? Hey, I've never been approached, or if I have been approached, it's like only a handful of times a year. And now this kind of gives birth to all these sort of nonverbal, what do you want to call it? Like nonverbal cues. Like everyone's so hyper focused on nonverbal cues. And you know what that creates? That creates something called analysis paralysis. It's when you analyze the situation so much in your head, you analyze it so much in your head that when it actually comes to initiating it, when it actually comes to the plan of action, you're kind of stuck in this phase of paralysis. And that right there happens on both sides. Because on one end, and a lot of this has to do with being overstimulated as well, from at least from what I've found, where social media especially, a lot of people say, well, it's social media that's kind of corrupting the mind, which that is true, but I also think there is something to be said about the dopamine responses that social media kind of gives out to the chronically online individuals. And this kind of is what gives birth to a lot of women that are not very receptive in certain conversations. And I already know some people will say, well, yeah, but that's mainly due to them not saying something good enough to provoke a response or something along those lines. And yeah, like you absolutely could play that game where like you deserve the best of the best of the best, but at the end of the day, we're all human, like I'm not gonna have the best response for every conversation that I have with a lady, and vice versa. And so now we have everyone who's hyper overstimulated, and I would honestly argue that it typically is women that are way more overstimulated than men. Typically, there are a lot more women who are on social media, a lot more women who are on caffeine. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of men on caffeine, but it typically is because there's the whole culture of women and caffeine, especially in coffee shops like Starbucks or any sort of like small coffee shop like that. That's mainly kind of advertised towards the woman's side. Whereas men, there's typically not a whole lot of advertisement for men and coffee shops. And I'm not saying coffee is like the only thing that can really give people stimulation. Obviously there's vapes, there's football or any sports channel or like whatever. But with that being said, I'm just adding on to the variables that kind of attest to this, where women are kind of in this framework of, okay, well, let's just sit back and like let all the men do the work, which I understand, but it doesn't really work in this generation because and I found this with experience as like a shy guy kind of growing up, where you typically like you don't really feel empowered in that way when you hear women saying, well, as you should, or you hear saying like, oh, well, that's like the bare minimum. And like on the woman's side, it's also hard for them because when like the women are trying to be more understanding towards like the large majority of guys, which typically are overabundant in shyness, they kind of get talked down upon with their little cliques of girls. They'll say like, oh, well, like you're really gonna settle for something like that. And what that births is this very transactional sort of relationship. And even if like you end up finding the like this trophy wife sort of gal, or if you do end up finding like a man in finance, six figures, 6 feet in height, all that, the foundation of that relationship is built upon sand, as the Bible puts it. It's built upon sand where, yeah, it might seem good, it might even feel good at first, but like you're both human at the end of the day. And eventually what that relationship boils down to, once you're kind of confronted with so many hardships, is that you realize like, man, like all it is transactional. Like I only got with this girl because of like the body she brings. I only got with this guy because of maybe his finances, and he said all the right things and he did all the right things in the moment. But like once you kind of get to know each other, you're like, man, this isn't the person at face value. And I'm not saying to settle for some like bum on the street who's like hooked on drugs and trying to like get you hooked on drugs. And same thing for the men dating women. I'm not saying for men to date this, whatever you want to call it, gold digger, like women who typically don't have like your best interest in mind and are just trying to use you for their own satisfaction. I'm not saying any of that. Obviously have standards, but obviously recognize like we're all human as well. And that goes for both sides. Not just the men, but also the women as well. And I've seen an overabundance of people say, well, there's women that are too confident nowadays. Someone needs to humble them in some way. Honestly, I used to think that as well. But man, something that I realized with women is that like you can't really knock them down and expect them to really learn in that way. You need to, and you can't always do this, but you need to kind of convince the woman to empower you in like some way and say like, hey, I understand, like I'm not in the best situation right now. However, I'm trying to get there. And if a woman is able to stick by a man in hardships and just believe in him, even at the lowest of the low and the rock bottom, those relationships typically last a lifetime, rather than what social media kind of pushes is these very transactional relationships where it's like, well, if the woman starts to falter, oh, well, if the man starts to falter, if you're able to get through those hardships, whatever it is, maybe you guys are getting into fights constantly. Maybe you guys are kind of being very distant, maybe you guys aren't even sleeping in the same bed. But if you're able to get through those hardships, and if you're able to come out on the other side, man, you'll be leagues better than when you first initially started. I know it might seem hard, and the pressure from the social media is immense when it comes to this kind of stuff, where you're being tempted in that way to just break off the relationship, to go find a new man, to this wife she's not like putting out, or maybe like something like that, which there is something to be said about those. If like you really have tried, you really have given it your all, and it's been maybe years and it's only getting worse, and it's kind of like that unrequited love where it's like one side is just giving all the love and the other side's not giving any. Years have gone by, then yeah, you might have to look for something different. But I think typically not really. It's not really about like who you find, but it's about like who you can make it work with, and who's willing to kind of like work alongside you and not just give up so easily. And I think giving up so easily, and like the push of these social media niches, these social media trends, or whatever you want to call them, kind of birthed this huge tidal wave of nonverbal communication. Now I think it came out as like 90 some odd percent of all communication is nonverbal. People like you just typically don't have people approaching anyone anymore. Like no one does a cold approach anymore because of the fear mongering on social media, and honestly, hot take, because it usually doesn't work. It usually doesn't work as much as people would like to try and advertise it, especially in like more of like a long-term relationship sense. And the reason I believe this is because nothing's spontaneous anymore. Nothing's spontaneous. Everyone wants more of like a formal approach, which isn't all bad. But that's not life though. Life isn't all about formality. Life isn't about like scheduling everything in advance. A lot of life is just kind of spontaneous, and a lot of people, they're just kind of overstimulated with work, with social media, with maybe other hardships that they're dealing with that like you don't know about, to the point where it's like, man, I can't deal with this right now. And it goes on both sides with men and women. I've had women approach me for like in the gym and try and like strike up a conversation, and I'm just not ready for that kind of spontaneous activity. And I kind of choke up a little bit. I choke up a little bit to the point where the conversation just dies down, because I'm trying to think so hard of like what to say, because I'm not used to that spontaneous sort of activity. And typically this spontaneous activity can be kind of done away, if you get rid of all the stimulants, if you kind of embrace the boredom factor of life. Life isn't meant to be all about like staying stimulated all the time, and that's, when you say it out like that, then when you say it out loud like that, it just kind of sounds obvious, but not a lot of people think about it like that. Everyone's just staying stimulated nonstop, and I believe a lot of this can be done away with if men are kind of more empowered in that way to kind of lead, and obviously lead in a good way, not in a sort of narcissistic kind of like douchey way, but in a way that actually prospers, in a way that actually has like some longevity, and that's grounded in character, and especially in Christ. And, this is also why I think it's such a problem for women to be the ones that have more confidence, is because they get stimulated way easier than men do. Men typically are able to, I think, withstand more stimulation of life. And, I think there's also imbalancement in who should be more stimulated and who should be less stimulated in life. I think women being more stimulated leads to, when you try to strike a conversation with a lot of women, they typically aren't super receptive, unless, because I went to the bookstore, and, dude, I'm telling you, the librarians, whatever you want to call it, dude, these ladies are so receptive to speaking, and not even in like a flirtatious way always, but even in just having a nice conversation. And I think that's because, dude, they know how to set down the phone. They know how to avoid that quick and easy sort of like gratification. And they know how to, manage their stimulation. And don't get me wrong, sometimes, and more often times than I would like to admit, I'm very stimulated to the point where I don't want to talk about anything, and I try to give like these responses to women. It's so weird how it works, because when I am overstimulated, I don't feel like talking, and maybe in a sense that kind of attracts women. They think like, oh, he's super confident. Reality, I'm overstimulated and I just don't feel like talking. And then women try and like come and approach me, I got nothing to say, because I'm so in my like doom scroll, Gen Z or Zoomer mind, to the point where like I just don't have anything to say. Like I try to cook up a response in my head, but I can't, because it's so overstimulated with dopamine. Now, with all that being said, kind of wrapping this all up, I do believe it's good, and just kind of reiterating, I do believe it's good that, a lot of women are confident in that sense. But I also think sometimes it's misplaced confidence. Like you're confident in yourself. Man, why not be confident in like someone else, something bigger than you? And, for the men, it's like, well, why not, feel empowered in a way? Why not try? Why not just give it your all, whatever it is? And, it definitely is easier said than done when everyone says like, oh, well, if men were just to try and like approach whatever. And believe me, like I'm one of the men that, doesn't really make excuses, and like I actually do go out and try. But man, it's so hard, because a lot of these women, they're overstimulated with whatever. It could be work, it could be social media, it could be whatever they're dealing with in their personal lives, that they just kind of find hard to like not stir up in their head, and really creating that constant stimulated mindset, to the point where like, yeah, like you do approach them, but they don't really say anything back. And in essence, this kind of creates the shy men epidemic, where it's, men in a way kind of feel like they're not, doing something right, or, they typically aren't as social as women. And this is another thing, is that women typically are more like social in essence, but that's also because more people approach women on a day-to-day basis, whereas men, like it's very like once in a blue moon that someone approaches you. And I'm not saying like one's better than the other, but it's just coming from a point of understanding of why women typically are and seem overly confident, and we have like this oversupply of women being confident and kind of in a way expected to lead because they have so much confidence. And men on the other side are typically super low and in demand of more confident men, typically to the point where it's like, if you do find a man that's confident, you're kind of expecting him to do like everything. And then that's like that repeated cycle of, well, a confident man approaches a lady who seems interested and seems approachable, but isn't really receptive to anything about in the conversation. And I think that's where I want to end it today. All right. Thank you. God bless.